The dim lights of Murphy's Tavern cast long shadows across the worn wooden floor as Sarah Mitchell sat alone at the far end of the bar, her fingers wrapped around a glass of whiskey she hadn't touched in 20 minutes. The small coastal town of Oceanside had always been a military hub, but tonight the bar was packed with Marines from Camp Pendleton, their loud voices and boisterous laughter filling every corner of the establishment. Sarah kept her head down, hoping to blend into the background. At 28, she had learned the art of invisibility in crowded spaces. Her shoulder-length brown hair fell across her face as she stared into her drink. Trying to ignore the growing tension in the room, she wore simple jeans and a black t-shirt. Nothing that would draw attention to herself. To anyone watching, she looked like just another civilian trying to enjoy a quiet drink. The trouble started when Corporal Jake Morrison and his 3 buddies noticed her sitting alone. Morrison was the kind of Marine who thrived on attention and dominance. Standing 6 feet tall, with the build of someone who spent every free moment in the gym, his buzz cut was regulation perfect, and his cocky grin never seemed to leave his face. He had been drinking for 2 hours, celebrating his recent promotion, and his judgment was clouded by alcohol and arrogance. "Hey there, sweetheart," Morrison called out as he approached Sarah's end of the bar, his boots clicking against the floor with military precision. His friends followed behind him like a pack of wolves, smirking and exchanging glances. "You look mighty lonely over here, all by yourself." Sarah glanced up briefly, her green eyes meeting his for just a moment before she looked away. "I'm fine, thanks," she replied quietly, hoping her disinterest would send a clear message. But Morrison wasn't the type to take a hint. He slid onto the bar stool next to her, despite there being plenty of empty seats elsewhere in the bar. "Come on. Don't be like that. We're celebrating tonight, and a pretty girl like you shouldn't be drinking alone." His voice carried the confidence of someone who was used to getting what he wanted. The bartender, an older man named Pete who had been running Murphy's for 15 years, watched the interaction with growing concern. He had seen situations like this before, and they rarely ended well. Pete knew Sarah as a regular customer, who always kept to herself, never caused trouble, and always left good tips. He also knew the type of Marines Morrison represented, the ones who thought their uniform gave them license to act however they pleased. "Really, I'm just here to have a quiet drink and go home," Sarah said, her voice remaining calm and controlled. She had dealt with men like Morrison before. During her years of service, she knew that showing any sign of aggression or fear would only escalate the situation. Morrison's friends had now formed a loose semicircle around Sarah's position at the bar, effectively cutting off her easy exit routes. Sergeant Rick Valdez stood to her left, a stocky man with tattoos covering both arms and a permanent scowl etched into his features. Private First Class Tommy Chen positioned himself near the restroom hallway, while Lance Corporal Marcus Williams leaned against a nearby pool table, all of them watching the interaction with amusement. "Oh, come on," Morrison continued, his voice getting louder and more insistent. "We're United States Marines, honey. We put our lives on the line every day to protect people like you. The least you could do is show a little appreciation." He signaled to Pete for another round of drinks, clearly planning to stay put for a while. Sarah felt her jaw tighten at his words, but she kept her expression neutral. If only he knew, she thought to herself. If only any of them knew what she had actually done in service to her country. But that was information she couldn't share. Information that was classified at the highest levels. Her real identity, her real service record, was something that could never be discussed in a place like this. The bar's atmosphere had shifted noticeably. Other patrons had begun to take notice of the situation developing at the end of the bar. Some looked uncomfortable and began to leave, while others watched with morbid curiosity. The jukebox continued to play classic rock songs, but the music seemed to fade into the background as tension filled the air. "Look, guys," Pete finally spoke up from behind the bar, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had broken up countless bar fights over the years. "Maybe you should give the lady some space. She's just trying to enjoy her drink in peace." Morrison turned his attention to the bartender, his eyes narrowing with irritation. "We're not causing any trouble here, old man. Just having a friendly conversation with a fellow American. You got a problem with Marines talking to civilians?" The implied threat in Morrison's voice was clear, and Pete knew he was walking a dangerous line. Murphy's Tavern depended on military clientele for most of its business, and alienating a group of Marines could have serious consequences for the establishment. But Pete also had a responsibility to protect his customers, especially when they were clearly being harassed. Sarah recognized the difficult position Pete was in, and she didn't want him to suffer because of her situation. She had been trained to handle much worse scenarios than this, even though her training was something she could never reveal. Her years as a Navy SEAL had prepared her for combat situations that these Marines couldn't even imagine, but she was also bound by oath and classification levels that meant she had to endure their harassment without revealing her true capabilities. "It's okay, Pete," she said softly, though her mind was already calculating distances, exit routes, and potential defensive positions. Her training never truly turned off, even in civilian settings. "I can handle myself." Morrison laughed loudly at her comment, slapping his hand on the bar. "Handle yourself? That's cute, sweetheart. You know what real handling looks like?" He flexed his bicep, showing off muscles that had been built through years of military training and conditioning. "This is what real strength looks like. This is what keeps America safe." Valdez chimed in from Sarah's other side, his voice slurred from alcohol consumption. "Yeah, honey, you civilians have no idea what we go through, the sacrifices we make, the training we endure. We're warriors, and we deserve respect." Sarah took a slow sip of her whiskey, using the moment to control her breathing and maintain her composure. The irony of the situation was almost overwhelming. These men were lecturing her about military service and sacrifice while she sat there with experiences that made their training look like summer camp. She had completed missions in hostile territories that remained classified at levels these Marines would never achieve clearance for. The training that had been drilled into her during SEAL preparation was unlike anything these Marines had experienced. While they had gone through standard boot camp and infantry training, she had endured months of the most brutal military conditioning known to the American Armed Forces. She had learned to survive in conditions that would break most people, had mastered weapon systems these Marines had never even seen, and had completed operations that would never appear in any public record. But none of that mattered now, because her service record was buried so deep in classified files that it might as well have never existed. To the world, including these Marines, she was just another civilian. Just another woman who needed their protection and should be grateful for their service. Morrison leaned closer to her, his breath reeking of beer and whiskey. "You know what I think? I think you need to learn some appreciation for the men who keep you safe. How about you let us buy you a few drinks, show you a good time, and maybe you'll understand what real heroes look like?" The other patrons in the bar had begun to take notice of the escalating situation. Some were clearly uncomfortable and were finishing their drinks quickly to leave, while others watched with the kind of morbid fascination that people have when witnessing a potential conflict. The bartender continued to watch nervously, unsure of how to defuse the situation without making things worse. Sarah knew she was running out of options. These Marines had effectively surrounded her position at the bar, and their behavior was becoming increasingly aggressive. She could easily disable all four of them before they knew what was happening, but doing so would raise questions she couldn't answer and potentially expose information that was classified at the highest levels of government. Her training had taught her that sometimes the best tactical decision was to appear weak while gathering intelligence and waiting for the right moment to act. These Marines had no idea that the woman they were harassing had completed missions that their commanding officers would never be briefed on, had training that exceeded their wildest imagination, and possessed skills that could neutralize threats they couldn't even comprehend. As Morrison continued his harassment, leaning even closer and placing his hand on the bar next to her drink, Sarah made a decision. She would give them one final warning, one last chance to walk away before this situation escalated beyond their control. But she knew, based on their behavior and attitude, that they wouldn't take the warning seriously. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would shatter these Marines' understanding of strength, service, and sacrifice. They thought they knew what a warrior looked like, but they were about to discover that real warriors sometimes came in packages they never expected. Sarah finished her whiskey in one smooth motion, set the glass down on the bar with deliberate precision, and slowly turned to face Morrison directly. The movement was fluid and controlled, like a predator finally deciding to acknowledge a threat. Her green eyes met his with a steadiness that should have been his first warning that this situation was about to change dramatically. The calm before the storm was about to end. "You want to know about real service?" Sarah asked quietly. Her voice so calm it seemed to cut through the bar's ambient noise like a blade. Morrison blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the sudden change in her demeanor. The woman who had been sitting passively at the bar just moments before now carried herself with a presence that filled the space around her. Morrison recovered quickly, his alcohol-fueled bravado returning. "Oh. Now you want to talk? What could you possibly know about service, princess? You sit here in your safe little civilian world, while real warriors like us put our lives on the line." Sarah stood up slowly from her bar stool. And for the first time, Morrison noticed something he had missed before. Despite being only 5'6", she moved with a precision and control that was distinctly military. Her posture was perfect, her balance centered. And there was something in her eyes that spoke of experiences far beyond anything he had encountered. "You think I don't know about sacrifice?" Sarah asked, her voice still eerily calm. "You think I don't understand what it means to serve?" She took a step toward Morrison. And instinctively, he took a step back. "Let me ask you something, Marine. What's the longest you've ever been deployed?" Morrison straightened up, puffing out his chest. 15 months in Afghanistan. 2 tours. Saw plenty of action. More than you could ever imagine." Sarah nodded slowly, as if considering his answer. "Afghanistan. That's tough duty. I respect that." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Now let me tell you about my longest deployment. 22 months in places so classified I can't even tell you the hemisphere. Operations so secret they don't exist in any official record." Valdez laughed loudly, the sound harsh and mocking. "Lady, you're full of it. Women don't serve in combat roles like that. And they sure as hell don't serve in classified operations. You watch too many movies." The other Marines chuckled along with Valdez, but their laughter was becoming less confident. There was something about Sarah's presence that was beginning to unnerve them, something they couldn't quite identify but instinctively recognized as dangerous. Sarah turned her attention to Valdez, her green eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made him stop laughing. "You're right about one thing, Sergeant. There aren't many women who serve in those roles. The selection process has a 97% failure rate. The training takes 2 years. Most people who attempt it suffer permanent injuries. Many don't survive." She moved closer to the group, and now all 4 Marines could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The woman they had been harassing was transforming before their eyes into something they couldn't categorize or understand. "But you know what's funny?" Sarah continued, her voice taking on an edge that made Pete the bartender reach instinctively for the phone to call the police. "Some of us made it through. Some of us completed training that makes Marine boot camp look like summer camp. Some of us served in units that don't officially exist, carrying out missions that will never be declassified." Morrison tried to regain control of the situation, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Look, lady, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but you need to calm down. We're just trying to have a friendly conversation here." Sarah smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "A friendly conversation? Is that what you call surrounding a woman at a bar and refusing to let her leave? Is that what they taught you about respect in the Marines?" Chen, who had been standing near the restroom hallway, decided to assert himself. "We didn't stop you from leaving. You can walk away anytime you want." Sarah turned to look at Chen, then deliberately scanned the positions of all 4 Marines. They had unconsciously maintained their formation around her, blocking the most direct routes to the exit. "Can I?" she asked. "Tommy Chen, Private First Class, stationed at Camp Pendleton for 8 months. You're standing in front of the hallway that leads to the back exit. Rick Valdez, you're blocking my path to the front door. Marcus Williams, you're positioned to intercept if I try to go around the pool table. And Jake Morrison, you're standing directly in my personal space." The 4 Marines exchanged glances, suddenly realizing that she knew their names, ranks, and positions despite never having met them before. Morrison felt a chill run down his spine as he realized she had been gathering intelligence on them the entire time they thought they were in control. How do you know our names? Morrison demanded, his earlier swagger replaced by genuine concern. Sarah's smile widened slightly. Jake Morrison, 24 years old, from Cleveland, Ohio. Joined the Marines straight out of high school. Recently promoted to corporal. You've got a tattoo of your mother's name on your left shoulder and a scar on your right knee from a training accident at Paris Island. Morrison's face went pale. The information she was rattling off wasn't public knowledge. Some of it was from his military records. Some from personal conversations he'd had with his unit members. Rick Valdez, Sarah continued, turning to the stocky sergeant. 30 years old, married. 2 kids back in Texas. You've been in the Marines for 12 years and you're thinking about re-enlisting. You've got a disciplinary action in your file for a bar fight in Tijuana last year. Valdez's mouth fell open. The disciplinary action was supposed to be confidential military information. Sarah turned to Chen. Tommy Chen, 21 years old. First deployment. Sending most of your pay home to help your parents with their restaurant in San Francisco. You're scared about your upcoming deployment to the Middle East because you've never been in actual combat. Chen's face flushed red with embarrassment and fear. How could this woman possibly know such personal details about his life? And Marcus Williams, Sarah said, looking at the lance corporal leaning against the pool table. 23 years old. Grew up in foster care. Joined the Marines to have a family and find direction in life. You're good at your job, but you follow guys like Morrison because you're still trying to prove you belong somewhere. The bar had gone completely quiet. Even the jukebox seemed to have stopped playing, though the silence was probably just the result of everyone's attention being focused on the unfolding confrontation. Other patrons were staring openly now, sensing that something significant was happening. Williams pushed himself away from the pool table, his face showing a mixture of anger and confusion. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. "How do you know all that?" Sarah's expression became serious, all traces of her earlier smile disappearing. "I know, because I'm trained to gather intelligence. I know because I've been watching and listening since the moment you walked into this bar. I know, because assessing potential threats and gathering tactical information is what I was trained to do." Morrison tried one last time to assert his authority. "Look, I don't care what kind of training you think you have. We're United States Marines. And we don't take threats from civilians." Sarah's posture shifted subtly, and suddenly she looked less like a woman in a bar and more like a soldier preparing for combat. "That's where you're wrong, Corporal Morrison. I'm not threatening you. I'm educating you." She moved so quickly that none of the 4 Marines had time to react. In one fluid motion, she stepped forward, grabbed Morrison's wrist, applied pressure to a specific point that caused his hand to go numb, and twisted his arm behind his back. The entire movement took less than 2 seconds, and suddenly Morrison found himself immobilized and facing away from Sarah. "This is a basic control hold," Sarah said calmly, as if she were conducting a training exercise. "I'm applying pressure to your radial nerve while controlling your shoulder joint. If I increase the pressure slightly, I can cause temporary paralysis of your entire arm. If I increase it significantly, I can cause permanent nerve damage." The other 3 Marines started to move forward to help their friend, but Sarah's voice stopped them cold. "I wouldn't recommend that. Gentlemen, from this position, I can disable Corporal Morrison permanently before any of you can reach me, and then we'd have to discuss what happens next." Valdez reached for his phone, probably to call for backup or military police, but Sarah spoke again before he could dial. "Sergeant Valdez, I should mention that this entire conversation has been recorded." She nodded toward a small device that had been sitting on the bar, near her drink. "Audio and video. Everything from your initial harassment to the current situation. I'm sure your commanding officer would be very interested to see how his Marines conduct themselves in civilian establishments." The 4 Marines found themselves in a situation they had never trained for. They were being controlled and outmaneuvered by a woman they had dismissed as a harmless civilian. Everything they thought they knew about strength, training, and military superiority was being challenged in ways they couldn't understand. Pete, the bartender, watched in amazement as the situation that had seemed destined for violence was being controlled by the quiet woman who had been sitting alone at his bar. He had no idea who she really was, but he could see that these Marines were now completely out of their depth. Sarah maintained her hold on Morrison while addressing the group. "Now, gentlemen, we're going to have a real conversation about service, sacrifice, and respect. And you're going to listen carefully, because this is the most important lesson you'll ever receive about what it truly means to be a warrior." The education of 4 cocky Marines was about to begin, and they were going to learn that real strength wasn't always what they expected it to be. Sarah released Morrison's arm and stepped back, allowing him to turn around and face her. The corporal rubbed his wrist, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and growing respect. The casual confidence he had displayed earlier was completely gone, replaced by the wariness of a soldier who had just encountered a superior force. "Sit down," Sarah said quietly, but the command carried absolute authority. All 4 Marines found themselves moving to nearby chairs without conscious thought, their military training responding to the tone of someone who clearly outranked them in ways they were only beginning to understand. Sarah remained standing, her posture relaxed but alert. She looked at each of the Marines in turn, her green eyes assessing them like a commanding officer evaluating new recruits. "Let me tell you about real service," she began, her voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. "My name is Sarah Mitchell, and for 8 years, I served in a unit that doesn't officially exist. The Navy SEALs have a saying, 'The only easy day was yesterday.' But there's another unit, one that makes SEAL training look like basic preparation." Morrison's eyes widened. "You're saying you were a SEAL?" His voice was barely above a whisper. Sarah shook her head. "I'm saying I was something beyond that." The selection process started with 200 candidates. 12 graduated. Of those 12, only 4 completed the full training program. I was one of them. She began to walk slowly around the group, her movement controlled and predatory. "While you were learning to march in formation and follow orders, I was learning to survive in conditions that would kill most people. While you were doing push-ups and running obstacle courses, I was mastering weapon systems that most military personnel will never see." Valdez found his voice, though it lacked its earlier bravado. "What kind of missions?" Sarah stopped walking and looked directly at him. "The kind that never happened, Sergeant. The kind that prevent wars instead of fighting them. The kind that keep America safe while most people sleep peacefully in their beds, never knowing how close they came to disaster." She moved to the bar and picked up her empty whiskey glass, holding it up to the light as if examining it. "I've spent months in hostile territories where capture meant torture and death, not just for me, but for everyone depending on the intelligence I was gathering. I've made decisions that affected the lives of thousands of people. Decisions that had to be made in seconds, with incomplete information." Chen leaned forward in his chair, his earlier fear replaced by genuine curiosity. "Why are you telling us this? Isn't this information classified?" Sarah set the glass back down and turned to face him. "Because you 4 need to understand what real strength looks like. You came into this bar tonight thinking that your muscles and your uniforms made you powerful. You thought that because you're Marines, you were automatically superior to everyone else here." She gestured around the bar, where other patrons were still watching the confrontation with fascination. "But real strength isn't about intimidating civilians or harassing women who are just trying to have a quiet drink. Real strength is about protecting people who can't protect themselves. It's about sacrifice, discipline, and honor." Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "We thought we were just having some fun. We weren't trying to hurt anyone." Sarah's expression hardened. "Fun? You surrounded a woman at a bar, blocked her exit routes, and refused to leave her alone when she asked you to. You used your status as Marines to try to intimidate her into doing what you wanted. That's not fun, Corporal. That's predatory behavior." The bar had gone completely silent. Even Pete had stopped moving, transfixed by the lesson being delivered to the 4 Marines. Other patrons who had been preparing to leave were now staying to watch the conclusion of this unprecedented confrontation. William spoke up, his voice small and uncertain. "We didn't realize. I mean, we thought." "You thought what?" Sarah interrupted. That because I was alone and female, I was automatically vulnerable? That because you outnumbered me 4-1? You had all the power in this situation. She walked over to Williams and crouched down so she was at his eye level. Marcus, you told me earlier that you joined the Marines to find a family and prove you belong somewhere. Real belonging doesn't come from following bullies or intimidating innocent people. It comes from standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Williams nodded slowly, his eyes showing genuine remorse for his actions. Sarah stood and addressed the group again. During my time in service, I worked with Marines, soldiers, airmen, and sailors. The best of them, the ones who truly understood what the uniform meant, would never have behaved the way you did tonight. They understood that representing the United States military means being held to a higher standard, not using your status to take advantage of others. Valdez cleared his throat nervously. What happens now? Are you going to report us to our commanding officer? Sarah considered the question for a long moment. That depends on what you do next. You have a choice to make. All of you. You can continue to be the kind of Marines who bring shame to the uniform, or you can learn from this experience and become the kind of warriors your country actually needs. She pulled out her phone and showed them the recording device she had mentioned earlier. This conversation, including your harassment of me and my response, is documented, but I'm not interested in destroying your careers unless you force me to. Morrison leaned forward, his expression serious. What do you want from us? Sarah smiled. And for the first time since the confrontation began, there was genuine warmth in the expression. I want you to remember this night every time you put on that uniform. I want you to remember that real warriors protect the innocent, not prey on them. I want you to understand that strength without honor is just brutality. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a card, placing it on the table between them. This is the number for a veterans counseling service. All of you should call them, not because there's something wrong with you, but because transitioning from military training to civilian interaction is difficult, and you need to learn how to be Marines without being bullies. Chen picked up the card and examined it. You're really not going to report us? Sarah shook her head. Not if you prove to me that tonight was a learning experience, rather than just another night of bad behavior. I want each of you to write a letter to your commanding officer, explaining what happened here tonight and what you learned from it. Not a confession of wrongdoing, but a reflection on what it means to truly serve with honor. She began walking toward the exit, then turned back to address them one final time. And, gentlemen, if I ever hear that any of you have engaged in this kind of behavior again, that recording will find its way to your CO, your families, and every social media platform I can access. The choice of who you become from this point forward is entirely up to you. Morrison stood up quickly. Wait. We never got your name. I mean, your real name. Sarah paused at the door and looked back at him. For a moment, the carefully controlled mask slipped, and they could see the weight of years of classified service in her eyes. My real name is something you'll never find in any public record, Corporal. My service history is buried in files so classified that your security clearance would never allow you to access them. But that's not what's important here. She opened the door, letting the cool night air flow into the bar. What's important is that 4 Marines learned tonight that real strength comes from protecting others, not dominating them. What's important is that you understand your uniform represents something bigger than your individual ego. As she stepped through the doorway, her voice carried back to them one last time. Be better, Marines. Gentlemen, your country deserves it. And so do the people you've sworn to protect. The door closed behind her, leaving the 4 Marines sitting in stunned silence. Around them, the bar slowly returned to its normal activity. But the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. Other patrons looked at the Marines with a mixture of curiosity and newfound respect for the lesson they had just witnessed. Pete the bartender approached their table, his expression thoughtful. I've been running this place for 15 years, he said quietly. I've seen a lot of fights, a lot of tough guys, and a lot of people who thought they were something special. But I've never seen anything like what just happened here. Morrison looked up at him, his face pale and shaken. Pete, who was that woman? I mean, really? Pete shrugged, but there was respect in his voice when he spoke. I don't know her real story, son, but I can tell you that she comes in here maybe once a month. Always alone. Always quiet. Always polite. Tips well. Never causes trouble, and always pays in cash. He paused, wiping down their table with his bar towel. What I do know is that you four just got schooled by someone who's seen things you can't even imagine, and if you're smart, you'll take her advice to heart. Over the following weeks, all four Marines found themselves changed by their encounter with Sarah Mitchell. Morrison wrote his letter to his commanding officer and began attending the counseling sessions she had recommended. He discovered that true leadership meant protecting those who were vulnerable, not exploiting his position for personal gain. Valdez went home that weekend and had a long conversation with his wife about respect, honor, and what kind of example he wanted to set for his children. He began volunteering with a local veterans organization that helped military families dealing with deployment stress. Chen called his parents that night and told them about his encounter with someone who had shown him what real courage looked like. He threw himself into his training with renewed purpose, determined to become the kind of Marine who would make his family proud. Williams took perhaps the most significant lesson from the encounter. He realized that belonging to something meaningful wasn't about following the loudest voice in the room, but about standing up for what was right even when it was difficult. He began mentoring younger Marines, teaching them about honor and respect. 6 months later, Morrison would be selected for leadership training after his commanding officer noticed significant improvements in his conduct and attitude. Valdez would receive a commendation for his work with military families. Chen would excel in his deployment, earning the respect of his unit through his professionalism and courage. Williams would be promoted ahead of schedule after repeatedly demonstrating the kind of moral leadership the Marines valued most. None of them ever saw Sarah Mitchell again, but they never forgot the night a mysterious woman in a small bar taught them what it truly meant to be warriors. They each kept the lesson she had given them close to their hearts. That real strength wasn't about what you could take from others, but what you were willing to sacrifice to protect them. And sometimes, late at night when they were standing guard duty or lying in their bunks, they would wonder about the woman who had served in units that didn't officially exist, who had completed missions that would never be declassified, and who had chosen to use her incredible skills not to destroy 4 young Marines, but to help them become better men. They had come into Murphy's Tavern that night thinking they knew what strength looked like. They left, knowing they had encountered a warrior whose service and sacrifice made their own achievements look small by comparison. And in learning that lesson, they had taken the first steps toward becoming the kind of Marines their country truly needed.